Hi. Okay, so Julia, I'm really, really, really blown away to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really humbled that you agreed to come on and have a chat with me. Well, obviously you're known for being fabulous, challenging, controversial, that would be fair to say, an avid and spontaneous singer, and obviously a rouser of spirits, that's also fair to say. I am a huge fan. And as someone obviously who's trying to hold the line on safeguarding, it's good to have mentors. And I do feel like you have been important to me because you are one of the bravest people in this, in the gender wars, if you like. So Dr. Julia Long, for those of you who do not know her, she is a scholar, a radical lesbian feminist writer. She's an activist in the battle against male violence against women. She's been working in it for a very long time, fighting for maintaining the rights of women and girls. And your academic work focused on the politics of the sex industry and pornography. And you completed your doctorate, which formed the title of your book, which was Anti-Porn, the Resurgence of Anti-Pornography Feminism, which you wrote in 2012. Your background was in teaching and the voluntary sector, and you worked in equalities policy in central and local government. You also organised the 2016 first ever feminist conference on transgenderism, which was called Thinking Differently. And you were also the lead author on numerous feminist census reports presented to Parliament, which documented all of the murdered women every year by men. And honestly, there's so many more things that I could tell about you. But Julia, you're so welcome, and thank you for coming on board and agreeing to talk to me today. So.
Well, thank you, Isla, very much, and thank you for those really lovely words that you said. And yeah, I mean, all I would say is, if you say that I'm controversial, I'm sure we can both agree it really doesn't take very much to be controversial, does it? Like, it really doesn't take much at all. So
It really
anyone who
doesn't.
isn't controversial, I wonder what they're doing, because
I
the
know.
bar is set pretty low. But yeah,
Absolutely
so
not. Well, we've met a couple of times in
yeah.
person, and actually we've also shared the wonders of London South Bank University because
Oh, that's right.
I was a senior lecturer there, and also my when I did a little bit of research on you and this conference was at Conway Hall, wasn't it? Which Thinking Differently, and that was
Yes.
actually where I did my first big lecture, actually, because we'd won this massive contract and we didn't have a room big enough. So I ended up being mic'd up at Conway Hall, which was a really, really scary experience for my first
Oh, wow.
big
And
gig.
when was that?
I can't really, it was in the 1990s some point,
Uh,
but there was all that wood. I remember the wood.
yeah,
I
it's
remember,
beautiful actually, isn't it? All that wood paneling. Yeah.
yeah, I remember
Yeah,
being,
I remember when we had the conference, someone was taking photos and we had these really beautiful photos of the speakers, because everyone was kind of set against this dark wood, and it kind of looked a bit, I don't know, like Vermeer or something. Like, it was a very nice, certainly in that regard, it's a really nice venue. I've had my ups and downs with Conway Hall in the past.
so I kind of thought about how we could break this down, because obviously there's this kind of mixed bag of people who kind of watch my channel. So I thought I'd try and engage you on a kind of number of different issues, and we could try and explain some of what's going on for the audience anyway. And I thought we'd start off with pronouns, because I thought, let's just not mess about. Let's go straight into let's get the big guns out.
Mm.
Because I can't think of anyone better really to try and talk about that. Thinking about some of the gateways really, and how I could phrase it. I mean, it's a gateway into the trans issue in many ways, because it's kind of like it's a grooming exercise, and it's a sort of it's like a neologism it's a PC set of authoritarianism It's into this kind of culture war, and it's otherwise known as comfort pronouns in many ways, where you're kind of met with these demands. In some cases, they're for neo pronouns like sie, them, there, and sometimes it's just for opposite sex pronouns. But whatever it is, often they're not in accordance with what your brain or instinct is telling you. Sometimes it's in email signatures or Zoom headings, by way of training, or on social media or face to face. So for the uninitiated, there's a lot of perils associated with this. And then there's also this other side of it. So there's the newbie sort of version of it. There's the initial thing, and then there's also this aspect, the illogical part of the people who are working within the movement, trying to assert the whole rights issue, who are also propping up the same notion of comfort pronouns by authenticating and verifying this idea of the true trans person and the trans child. And we have made some progress, I would say, on that in the last few years, but I thought we could maybe start off on how, the importance of pronouns. Let's just knock it out of the park.
Yeah. Actually, that's interesting. I've never actually heard that term comfort pronouns before.
Oh, really?
It's just like the language just, oh God, like it's like
Doesn't it makes
just
sense,
spawn more.
doesn't it?
But so do you mean, so they're words, the pronouns that are used basically at the request of someone else's the person who's
it's like
requesting
I don't believe it, but I'll do it for your comfort, to make.
Oh, I see, like politeness kind of thing, like the sort of courtesy type of thing. Yeah. Oh, it's quite comical, isn't it? So so the thing, I mean, I think we have to approach the question of using accurate pronouns as part of the whole wider thing of using accurate language, because pronouns are obviously just parts of speech and parts of language, aren't they? They serve a function to refer to a noun that's already been established, and so that's what their function is. But they're a part of language in the way that other nouns and adjectives and all the every other part of element of language structure, it sort of exists. And I think we have to, so I think we can get, because pronouns have ended up being so contested and controversial, we could say, that we kind of zoom in on those. But I think ultimately all of this begins and ends with the need for accurate and truthful language. If we are committed to using truthful language, why would we make an exception for one part of speech if not for others? Obviously, what happens is that people not only make exceptions for pronouns, but they make exceptions for all manner of things, and use a totally absurd, nonsensical language in lots in lots of different ways, and you're using lots of different kind of elements of vocabulary. But
I know that it's something which you've often ended up getting into areas of conflict with, but it's something which in fact you're saving yourself from if you're not on Twitter, because actually it is an ongoing battle. And in some cases people say that they're doing it in order to get a foot in the door, in order to be able to negotiate, and I can appreciate that premise, but there's also a big part of me which feels that actually that being part of a negotiation process and starting in the middle, it means that you're, and I've said this on a number of occasions, that if you're starting a negotiation process in the middle, then you're going to end up negotiating to the point where you end up with a homeopathic point that you end up getting on your side. Whereas if you start off saying no, this is what we want, and we're very clear, and we keep saying that.
I mean, in terms of the broader principle of language, and pronouns are obviously a part of language, as I say, I think if someone, what I've seen a lot is, various kind of critiques of gender identity ideology. There's just like been reams and reams written by now, hasn't there? And then in a lot of this work of these, whether it's blogs or published articles or whatever, over and over again, I see all of this analysis and thinking through all the implications of, you know, what happens when policy pretends that men can be women, you know, all of this analysis, and then they just seem to chuck it away by then referring to some men as she, and it's so completely contradictory. I don't know why anyone would want to do something that is actually part of the very problem that
Mm,
they are seeking to address and analyze. It just makes no sense. And I think in some ways it it indicates that you know, a lot of those voices that have come to prominence that do that, and we can think of, you know, half a dozen immediately off the top of my head, can't we?
yeah.
Those voices that have come to prominence that do that kind of thing, that do all this analysis, but then call men she routinely. Um, they what it seems to me they don't appreciate is the absolute importance of language to a feminist critique. You know, because you and I are probably both of a similar age where we can look back at the, you know, some of the second wave texts. There was a lot written about feminism and language and women and language, and we know that one of the fundamental principles is the accurate naming of reality by women, because
Mm,
as the likes of Mary Daly observed, or Andrea Dworkin, or any number of others, they observe that actually there's an intimate relationship between language and control, and whoever controls language then controls how we think, how we perceive things. And so, you know, there was some brilliant analyses of patriarchal language and women's kind of attempt to uh, to reclaim language for ourselves, or to, you know, accurately name, for example, things that hadn't been named before, like sexual harassment, you know, to actually name women's experience. And so I think if you're coming from that understanding, there's no way that you would use a pronoun that a man requests, that to pretend that he's a woman, because it's absolutely fatal, because the whole point is that the most necessary thing for our understanding is to understand what men are doing. And
mm,
in this case, you know, to understand that men are demanding that we pretend that they're women. And as soon as we start calling them she, we're just colluding with that, and we're not exposing the fact that it is a man, and we're sort of drawing a mask over his behavior and his demands. So I think, to me, the big part of the problem is that a lot of the women who've become quite prominent voices in this arena don't have that that sort of, what I would see as a real first principles kind of understanding, and
well,
that's why they seem very happy or
get
willing,
into
at
it.
least willing to go along with it.
Well, let me tie this into some other stuff then, for some of the people who, you know, haven't got the kind of feminist side to them,
Mm.
because obviously we're kind of dealing with this gender identity ideology, and this kind of fits in, I think, which is essentially about regressive gender stereotypes, and some of the interesting this will be right up your street, because essentially, you know, obviously you know better than me about this authoritarian political systems, you know, because you know, I haven't got the background in academic feminism that you do, but I have seen someone called it a gender identity, a bit more a patriarchy identity, which I thought was quite a nice way of putting it. But the other thing was about this the whole growth of transgenderism, which I thought maybe we could talk about, map out a little bit as a growth phenomenon. And obviously your very good friend Sheila Jeffreys has been incredibly important and written, you know, seminal work on this. And more recently, I've seen some people, talking of language, use some interesting terms. Synthetic sex identities was a term which was coined by Jennifer Billock. And another one was trans-sex role stereotypes by Dr. M. She came up with that very recently, which I thought was interesting. because I think they are also, you know, ultimately incredibly frustrated by this kind of battle of language. So maybe I can get you to talk about that, and also your important article that you did about a meaningful transition, because obviously those things, you know, you talked about this thing about, you know, this, whether or not there was this, people remain at the baseline, which obviously they do, or whether or not people are allowing them to then be granted this new status where they've had this, made a meaningful transition, where they've gone through this medical process. And, you know, those of us who are arguing, no, they haven't. They're, you know, nothing has happened just because you're sticking bits on and taking bits off. But, and then obviously we have the other facet, which is the 100-odd genders who are now, you know, joining on to the other side of that. So maybe you can talk to me about the meaningful transition article, because, you know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's quite a lot in all of that, so I don't want to lose any of those points that you raised. Just briefly, maybe, I hadn't heard those particular terms that you mentioned from Jennifer Bielek
Yeah,
and
the synthetic sex
Dr. M.
identity.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, I tend to think the most straightforward language that we can use
Just men
what I
or
yeah
women.
is what I
Yeah.
prefer, is that, and that is about naming what someone or what a group is doing, and like who is doing it, like, and who that group is. So I think, always, to be as clear as possible, I like to refer to men who demand that we pretend they're women, men who demand access to our spaces, men who demand some kind of social recognition, or, well, misrecognition that they are actually women, you know, who demand that their identity be, their constructed identity be validated and be, you know, approved and all that kind of thing. So I tend to just try to use really straightforward language, because one thing that I've sort of realized more and more in recent months is a lot of people really have very little idea um about any of this stuff still, and what's going on, and especially what's going on in schools. To be really as clear as possible, and I think Kelly J. Keane is really good on that, because she just uses such really clear language, and she speaks very directly and very truthfully, and very very powerfully. So yeah, so in terms of that whole idea of a meaningful transition, I wrote that, it's a few years ago now, but I wrote that because I just kept seeing this term that I just found like so ridiculous. I just kept seeing it used quite a bit, and in particular, I saw it being used by the men whose purposes it served, to try and weasel their way into women's groups and women's spaces. So at the time, there was, in Women's Place UK, they were giving quite frequent platforms to men who call themselves Christina or Debbie. And it was, so I did have a look at some of their talks, and I was struck by the way that they would refer to themselves, and this, or refer to those who have undergone a meaningful transition, and that then seemed to be picked up and used by women to justify their inclusion, and to, you know, and in fact we still see that whole idea now, that there are these kind of exceptions, you know, these men who are exceptions to the general rule, because I think with the you know, with what's happened in Scotland recently with the GRR bill going through, obviously now it's been blocked, but you know, actually gone through in the Scottish Parliament. There was an article, I don't know if you saw it, being shared around by this man who calls himself Christina Harrison,
Yeah.
and that was getting shared around, and it's just, I don't know, it just kind of beggars belief how women can see very clearly what's happening, you know, on one level, and then totally not see it. You know, just it kind of, you know, swivel around a bit, and suddenly, you know, it becomes they just can't see it. So anyway, so this it just struck me as this nonsense concept of this meaningful transition, because it struck me as so contradictory that these groups, um, whether it was online groups or these, real life groups like the Women's Place UK meetings, were giving um, were giving airtime. First of all, giving airtime to these men, but also giving airtime to this concept, because on one hand you have speakers saying, well, you can't change sex, there's and also obviously there was all the problem at the heart of the legislation, which is completely conflating sex and gender. So the original act was called the Gender Recognition Act, but it was actually about the falsification of someone's sex on their key documents. So there was that conflation and kind of just mix up right at the heart of it. So if you can't change sex, which obviously we can't, then how is there such a thing as a meaningful transition? Like, what is this meaningful transition from what to what? Like,
Mm.
what that is a man who goes around, moves around in the world and in his work. And, we know that with Debbie Hayton, he wrote the guide, the I think, was it the NASUWT,
Yeah, yeah,
the union guidance that uh, that basically means that that endorsed
yeah.
boys going into
In
girls'
girls'
toilets and
toilets,
all of that stuff,
and they have
and
been
so
essentially erased, yeah, in many schools.
exact yeah,
Mm.
and so and he goes around the world like calling himself Debbie and expecting women in the staff room to treat him as one of them, all of this kind of stuff. And with Christina Harrison, we know that he played in women's football teams, all of this kind of stuff. So they seem to justify all of this by saying that they've been through this meaningful transition, but it's a nonsense term, because if you can't change sex, what both of those men have done, seems to me, have, I don't know, done the usual kind of fraudulent thing that men do when they're claiming to be women or pretending to be women, is probably taking hormones, maybe having some sort of surgery. I really don't know. Um, but they certainly haven't transitioned from male to female, because it isn't possible. And using that phrase, I just think, is so duplicitous, because they're trying to separate themselves from all these other,
Right.
inverted
I mean,
commas, like extremists sort of.
that's essentially the heart of the issue, isn't it? Because
Mm,
it's saying we're, because in the 100 gender situation where all the fetishists and the furries, etc., and we can see them all saying that they're going to be arriving to protest in Glasgow this weekend. They need to step away from that and say, we're not like them. We are the meaningfully transitioned. We are different, and we need to
mm,
be treated, in special circumstance.
mm,
So, in terms of, obviously, we're now trying to move towards this repealing the GRA. And I
mm.
know it's something that you've been talking about. What's your kind of thoughts and feelings about that?
Yeah. Well, maybe just before we go on to that, I mean,
Yeah,
it's very clear to me that the likes of Hayton and Harrison, what they're doing is gatekeeping, isn't it? Because it suited them
right.
very well to have the Gender Recognition Act come in 2004. Suited them very well. They can get all their documents changed. I don't even know actually if they have got GRCs. I really don't know, and I don't care. It doesn't really seem to me that that relevant, because they act as though they have anyway. And plus, the certificate is totally like a nonsense, piece of nonsense anyway. But obviously, what they're doing is gatekeeping, and I think they've probably, both of them have spoken quite openly about this. That they're worried that they've been getting away with this for however many years, and they're worried now that the floodgates are going to open, that you've got all this kind of new generation of, I don't know, genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, trans this, demi that, whatever, all kind of uh, coming through, and they're worried that there's going to be a backlash against not only this new generation but also the likes of them. And what they've both claimed, um, quite sort of vociferously, is that they've been accepted for years and that no women have had a problem with it. And quite how anyone can give them the time of day when that's the kind of thing that they come out with. So again, I think the need for clear language is, it just, we can see why it's so essential, because what these men are telling us is that they have set out to enter women's spaces, to violate women's spaces, to force themselves into our spaces, and then to pretend that that's absolutely fine and that no one's got any sort of problem with it. And we know that maybe not all women have vocalized their discomfort or their objections to it, because firstly, because quite possibly through fear, through kind of social norms, that it's, it's, especially in maybe in sort of English society, it's quite a taboo to be very direct, and also through, of course, through female socialization. But but those men tell us exactly who they are and what they're about by that claim that every, women have had no problem with it whatsoever, when we are actually telling them very, very clearly, and they don't even need us to tell them, because it's so obvious. We have women only spaces for a reason, and they are far from being in any way an ally. They are proving that they are willing to violate women's spaces, and what they're afraid of is that if there's a backlash against the whole thing, then that will also mean that the game's up for them, which I hope it is very soon. And I think if they were any kind of ally, or who was, anti-sexist or anti-sex stereotyping, for a start, they'd stop going around calling themselves trans women and calling themselves names like Christina and Debbie, and basically gaslighting and coercively, trying to coercively control women to play along with it. So that's what I think about that. And then what was the next part? We were talking about the GRA. So I guess that I've kind of answered that bit as well. But yeah, of course, like the GRA, it was always an abject piece of absolute codswallop, and I can't see that anyone, that any self-respecting woman, or any man who cares about the truth and cares about women's safety and privacy, that I can't see how anyone would want to go along with that in any way, shape or form. And it's, the whole thing isn't in any way reformable, because it's just based on such claptrap in the first place. This idea, this complete lie that you can change sex, this nonsense of living in the acquired gender, which, as I know you completely agree, it's meaningless. What does it mean? Like what having long hair and wearing skirts or something like that, and giving yourself a woman's name? And we have to look at what underlies all of it. Is, well, I think Sheila Jeffreys, in her new book, Penile Imperialism, I think she does a really good exposition of what underlies all of it, which is this male sex right and male entitlement, and this kind of a will to power, I suppose, a will to power and a will to violate. So how anyone could think that any of that is in any way reformable, I really don't know. But yeah, we definitely have to repeal it, because the whole thing has just it's just given the leverage to bring in all these like really viciously anti-woman practices.
And we have effectively got self-ID in operation anyway now, and they are also protected under the Equality Act anyway. So it is really quite unnecessary. So just in the interest of time, I wanted to talk to you, obviously, and because of your anti-pornography background, I know that one of the things you'll be really upset to find out is this whole kind of issue which is affecting us in the schools area, about this huge movement of teaching children about, under this banner of sex positivity, and teenagers and younger are being taught that porn is acceptable and it's okay, And in many, some of the websites which are actively promoted have things like safe stroking, BDSM, sadomasochism, pornography, sex work is work. This whole scheme of thinking with these basic lunatic. There's books and books that I'm sort of working through, trying to critique and make different videos of. Parents are incredibly upset when they start finding out that their young children are being taught about, how to have anal sex and do this, that, and the other, and at young ages, and girls are being taught that this is all what they should be getting up to. I mean,
it's really hard not to despair, actually, isn't it? When when you list it all like that, it's really hard not to despair. I mean, if pornography is the sexual representation of woman hating, of woman hatred, um, and the subordination of women, then what on earth are we thinking of saying that, oh, that's fine, and teaching children that, that they just. I remember when I was doing my PhD, and when I was working in academia sort of after that, there was a lot of emphasis. There was so much rubbish sort of taught and going under the guise of research in terms of young women, and there was a whole area of studies of sort of young women and sexualization of young women and all that kind of stuff. And there seemed to be a big focus on a kind of media literacy, that we just have to teach girls and young women and boys as well, just to be more kind of like critical consumers of media literacy. But would we ever think that about any other sort of really viciously hateful material? I mean, I remember, I think I put this, I'm pretty sure I put this in my book, like, so when I was at school, I was at primary school, would have been sort of in the like mid 1970s, that kind of time.
mm,
And I remember, I won't say the name on here, but I remember we were a few afternoons we were read to by the head teacher, or head mistress as she would have been then. I was about 7, and we were read to from this book about this supposed little African boy, and it had a really, I don't know if you even remember this series of children's books.
I was in school in the 70s as well.
All right, so anyway, so this was being read to us, and then there were all these other kinds of books at the time that had pretty awful, not just stereotypical, but like really colonial views of
It was a bad time. Yeah.
yeah. So what I asked in the book was, so now on the whole we don't see too much of that, and we wouldn't expect that book to be read to children in primary schools. So I'm not saying obviously that we're no longer in any way, there's no problem of racism in this country, but would we say that that's a good thing or a bad thing that those books are no longer available? I think generally speaking, unless someone is an out and out racist, there would be a consensus that it's a good thing that children aren't taught that kind of racist material in schools anymore. So why on earth then are we saying that it's fine to take the norms of a really, not just a woman hating like set of representations or kind of genre or whatever you want to call it, but a set of representations that actually serve to subordinate women, to represent women as inferior, and they're like existing only to be used and abused by men? Why would we take the norms of that and then teach that as something that's positive for kids in school? Like, it makes no sense. And that's obviously not to say that that stuff isn't racist as well, because obviously pornography is probably the most racist cultural form, that if you can dignify it with the word culture. But if you look at the kind of categories of mainstream porn content, it's full of these categories like ebony and Asian and
Mm-hmm.
Japanese, and
Yeah,
all
yeah.
of these very, or blonde as well. But lots of things are very that are very racist.
Mm.
um but overwhelmingly the content is not just misogynist, but it's actually teaching that girls are there for the sexual use of boys, of men and boys.
Mm.
So how that is now being
Mm.
taught as something that's positive is
Under
absolutely,
under
it's
the
absolutely
banner of
staggering.
under the banner of queer theory, essentially.
Mm.
I mean, I'd love to you to cast your academic eye on queer theory and do some critique about it, because one of the things which really worries me is the future for LGB children at school, because the logical conclusion of our discussions as we finish up is to
Mm.
kind of cast our eye of concern to these children who are basically you know not yet at puberty, but starting to experiment and explore through child development, and then grow into themselves. But immediately the schools are embedding and indoctrinating about gender identity ideology, and almost pushing them down another avenue
Mm.
right before the concepts of sexuality have had time to normally fluoresce, if you like.
Mm.
Thereby they then become they believe themselves to be non-binary or some other gender identity, etc. We know that this is immensely homophobic. So thoughts and feelings and concerns and fears about the future for LGB children.
It's well, it's really, what can I say? Again, it's really dismal, and it's not even. I mean, I suppose in terms of the future, like we just have to we just have to stop it and turn it around, and that's like, there really is no alternative, because at the moment, I mean, just on that topic of the kinds of things that children kind of have foisted upon them and also have access to. I went into a local library, not a school library, but just a sort of general, local area library,
Mm.
um, a week or two back. And within, there were lots of, it was mainly mums and children, actually, sort of, mums, maybe grandmothers and children, like reading. It was really nice little sort of child's area. But then there was one section just at the sort of edge of that, um, that was, I can't remember. I saw about half a dozen books on, or different variations of basically peddling trans
Mm.
ideology onto
Yeah,
kids.
they
So
send
there
them.
was
They
that.
send them. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So there was one book called like she, her, he, him, or like something about
Mm.
pronouns. There was the autobiography by, do you know Alex Bertie? The young, well, she is a young lesbian, probably
Right.
not that young now, but who, inverted commas, transitioned, I think, in her late teens, something like that.
Right.
And of course now, like, there's such a production line, isn't there? They're all writing their autobiographies, all their stunning and brave autobiographies. So there was the Alex Bertie about how great it was being a trans man. There were various other, anyway, there's about half a dozen books, and then there was but there wasn't anything that had the word lesbian in the title. There was one book on sexuality, which actually I didn't have time to kind of hang about and read. But even though it had sexuality in the title, I seriously doubt that it had anything
Yeah.
good in it, because
Well, of course.
it's all so saturated with all the trans stuff now. And so kids, before they might even have it, from a really young age, before they even have any notion or sense of themselves as having a sort of some kind of developing sexuality, they're being introduced to this notion that you can be born in the wrong body, that you might look like a girl but you're really a boy, or that you might have been assigned female at birth and you're really, all this kind of stuff. They're accessing those ideas. That's what they're finding
Mm,
before anything else. And I
mm,
do wonder as well if um I mean, the way in which the word transgender has been so embedded so quickly, hasn't it? Like absolutely,
mm,
kind of like dizzyingly quickly, into education and schools, and I think maybe quite a lot of it is because people talk about there was this shift from transsexual to transgender, and I think partly it's because they
purposely.
wanted to use the word gender,
Yeah, clean it
but
up. Yeah.
also to kind of clean it up to get the word sex out of it. And I think, there's still such a taboo around the word lesbian.
Mm,
Maybe not quite as much, well, no, definitely not as much around the term gay, but certainly around lesbian. And so you can have, primary school kids having lessons where they're, taught to think about, oh, am I really a girl? Do I feel, all this? But they wouldn't be taught to consider whether they're lesbian or not, because I think that word lesbian now has become so sexualized. Most people only encounter it as a porn category,
mm,
because there's such a taboo around it.
mm,
So I think that's part of the problem. But um it I think also then when kids, and not even necessarily sort of young, potentially lesbian or gay children, but I think all kids, going into puberty, it's such a difficult time. They might have all kinds of anxieties, it's so stresses, fears, awkwardness. Obviously, for girls, there's the whole thing of how they're treated once their body, bodies start to develop into sort of adult women. Um, and now they've just got this very, very convenient label that makes sense of everything. Like,
and they're
oh,
being and they've
I'm
been
not
told
really
that
a girl. I'm
and they've
not
been
really a girl.
told that
I'm really a boy.
they have to accept boys as lesbians now, because inevitably in these uh, rainbow LGBT clubs at school, which are basically propagandizing, and even some of the groups tell them to hide, to don't tell the parents that you're running them, and hold them out of view, etc. But if you're being told that boys can be lesbians and that you have to accept lady dick,
Yeah. Mm.
then what are we doing to young lesbians, etc., and young gay boys and bisexuals? So well, look, I know you've got things to do, so before I say thank you, and I know that you've got a very busy life, but if you ever, if I could ever convince you to get back on the horse and come back to us, I know that there'll be many people who would be so delighted to welcome you back, and I could think of so many topics for you to write about right off the top of my head. I was wanting to write
Oh,
about.
oh, thanks, Isla. I haven't totally disappeared. I mean, I have been doing, various talks and
Yeah,
things. I
and
suppose the thing is I'm
WBI and
I'm
stuff.
not particularly online. So
Yeah,
you know what it's like. It's like if you're not online,
so,
you don't exist. But I
I
have been
know.
I have been doing sort of various sort of bits and pieces over the last few months. But thank you. And I have to say, it was just been so heartening to me when I've seen what some of you women on Twitter are doing. Like I can't even say, I was so really thrilled, and also just really relieved as well to see that there are women with such insight and such integrity. It really, yeah, I think we all need each other, don't we? So
Yeah, yeah.
we all support
There's
each
loads
other.
of feisty people, getting into it on a daily basis. So
So yeah, so I see.
thank you so much for giving me your time today, and I've really loved talking to you. And thank you very much.
Thanks. I don't know. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks, and yeah, hope we can catch up again soon.
Definitely.